Hello and welcome everyone to Ananke's third edition of Women in Literature Festival. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Professor Ziba Mir-Hosseini and Dr. Sofia Rehman, who will be discussing an amazing topic titled Justice, Gender Equality in Islam. So over to you, Sofia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sabine. Welcome to everybody who is joining us from around the world on this, sunny day where I am. I hope it's sunny wherever you are as well. And for those of you who are observing Ramadan, I hope that you are having a fruitful and blessed month, and that this conversation will feed the soul in the way that this month is supposed to. We have with us the wonderful Professor Ziba Mir-Hosseini, who I'm sure is not a stranger to any one of you, but for those of you who need refreshing, Professor Ziba is a legal anthropologist who specializes in Islamic law, gender and development. She has held a number of esteemed positions within academia, including research fellowships and visiting professorships at various prestigious institutions around the world. She is also a founding member of the Musawa Global Movement for Equality and Justice in the Muslim family, and I look forward to speaking to Professor Ziba more about her work, both as an academic and as an activist, paving the way for so many. Her publications include Marriage on Trial, a study of Islamic family law in Iran and Morocco, Islam and Gender, the Religious Debate in Contemporary Iran, Islam and Democracy in Iran, Control and Sexuality, the Revival of Zina Laws in Muslim Contexts, Gender and Equality in Muslim Family Law, Justice and Ethics in Islamic Legal Tradition. And of course, we have the two seminal works that have been published with Musawa movement. The first, which is Men in Charge, ? Rethinking Authority in Muslim Legal Tradition, and the recent phenomenal work, Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage. Today, we have the great pleasure of discussing her book, Journey Towards Gender Equality in Islam, where she does the generous service of introducing readers of all backgrounds to the idea of gender equality in Islam, how we arrive at gender equality through the Islamic tradition, and introduces us to 6 very important scholars who've contributed to this knowledge that we are all benefiting from and continue to benefit from and build upon too. So thank you, Professor Ziba, for joining us this morning.
Thank you, and thank you for this wonderful and generous introduction, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here.
Thank you. So I'm going to dive straight into the book. You begin this beautiful book with a poem. Early on, there's a poem. And what I love about this book, I've read so much of your academic work, and I followed you for many, many years, and your own work has informed mine so deeply. But I love that this book is so accessible. You know, it's written for everyone to read. And so I love that you begin Journey Towards Gender Equality in Islam with this beautiful poem by the Iranian poet Ahmad Shamlu, which is entitled This Dead End. And it's such a tragic lament of the loss of love, beauty, joy, and pleasure from the public sphere at the hands, sadly, of Muslim clerics. So by way of this poem, you introduce us to your own journey towards gender equality in Islam. And it's one that I'm fairly familiar with because I've read your work for so many years, but it's one that I never tire of listening to because it resonates so deeply for me as a Muslim woman who cannot believe that my beautiful faith could ever deliver me to any form of injustice or harm. So can you tell us about this journey? Have you arrived at gender just Islam? And how is that journey going?
It is still continuing, but that poem, which is by Ahmad Shamlu, he wrote it 6 months after the success of Iranian Revolution, which was really the zenith of political Islam. And political Islam was an unknown phenomenon. You know, now we know what is political Islam, and whenever it comes to power, what are the consequences. But that time, it was an ideal, it was an hope and full of promise. But what he says in his poem really becomes prophetic. And it spoke to me and my generation. And of course, the issue of class is very important. And it's much later that I realized that, when he talks about this dead end, which comes with an image of God, that you have to hide that God. And if somebody knocks at the door, it's not because they bring the light. They want to get rid of the light. And there is no time for love, for beauty, and also for thinking, for reason. And so looking back after so many years, I think, my journey was trying to find a way out of this dead end. And that was really the impetus. And I love that poem. And so after the Islamic Republic in 1979, at the time I was 28 and recently married, happily married. And suddenly I came to see a different face of Islam, different interpretation of Islam, which was not the Islam that I was brought up. And this was harsh. And I realized that as a woman, I actually am a second-class citizen in many ways. When I married with the idea that I'm an equal. And when my marriage broke down, I realized that I am not at equal, because my ex-husband, being Iranian, had an absolute right to divorce, and I needed to have a ground. And also I realized that this, because Iran was, before the revolution, was very modern, very secularized, but I realized that it is an absolutely thin wear on the society. Even, among the men, my father and my ex-husband, they were very modern, but suddenly this patriarchal element that interpretation of Islam gave legitimacy, it was there. So when my marriage broke down, I had finished my PhD and I chose to return to Iran in 1980. And I couldn't do anything. So what I did, I started studying Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, to find a way out of my own problem in marriage. So I did. But I actually became very interested in Islamic jurisprudence. And when I was able to get my divorce, leave the country, I came back to Cambridge, where I did my PhD as a postgraduate scholar. And it was then that I started a research project on marriage and divorce in Iran and Morocco. And that is 1980s. I would say that in 1980s, my question was that, what does it mean to be married and divorced under Islamic law? Where is the place of sacred in this law? And how women and men, especially women, relate to these patriarchal elements in the law. So being an anthropologist, I did not focus at the text, that is that jurisprudence. And I also the laws, but I did fieldwork in family courts in Iran, which after the revolution were presided over by religious judges. Then in between 1988 and 89, I went to Morocco and did a similar field work. And I think it was in Morocco that I reconciled with my tradition and faith, because I was extremely angry in 1980s. I think it is, if you're a woman and if you live under an Islamic republic, it's just normal to be angry. And you can see the young generation of Iranian women, how angry they are. and they're doing something about it. But my generation, the ideology was so strong, and we couldn't even dream of, in public space, we had to wear hijab. We couldn't even dream of taking it off, because also people were for it. It was not only state, people were for it. But in Morocco, doing field work on the same topic, but not being my own society, I was seeing exactly the similar patterns. And somehow, which was to my surprise, that I came to realize that women in Iran, even in a religious system, when the courts are presided over by religious judges, have a better access to justice and divorce. And it is exactly because they speak the same language as the law, which is the language of pre-modern interpretations of Islam. And they learn how to negotiate with it, how to bargain with it. Whereas in Morocco, being with the past colonial history of French, so it had a very formal legal system. And also a man had a unilateral right to divorce, so they didn't have, in 1980s, they didn't have to come to the court. And women of the middle upper classes never appeared to the court, because they were in the lawyers and the families negotiated. But the majority, or almost all the women who came, were lower middle classes, poor women, and they didn't speak that language of the law, because the language of the law in Morocco is standard Arabic, and the dialects in Morocco is very different. So I could see these changes, and I think it was then, I met with Fatima Mernissi, and she took me under her wing, and I came connected with women's group at that time who were struggling to change the family law, and they were active. So I think, I became a feminist there in 1980s. But I would say I became a secular feminist. I didn't work within religion. But when I finished my first book and first project, I really became interested in 1990s in the construction of gender in Islamic law. So I did, again, being an anthropologist, I did field work in the Center of Religious Learning in Qom in Iran. And by that time, I had started to study fiqh with an enlightened cleric. And he was interested to learn about feminism. And so we talked about that, and he taught me the text. And through him, I had access to go to Qom and did field work there. And I think it was in Qom that I became an Islamic feminist, because, I could see how women are treated and how they don't have voice. And it was there that I really wanted to be part of, not only an observer as an anthropologist, I wanted to be participant. I wanted to be participant in debates. So my second book is Islam and Gender. It is basically conversation with the clerics. And it was there that I realized that how important is to speak the language of jurisprudence, and how important is to have that knowledge. For instance, for my first book, I didn't make any distinction between Sharia and fiqh, because people do not make that distinction. The judges did not make that distinction. And in my first book, I have a footnote. But when I started research in Qom, I realized that I cannot have a conversation without that distinction, because they saw me as representative of feminist critique of Islam. So they wanted to know what is this critique, so to provide an answer for it. And they didn't see it as a critique. They saw it as a doubt. I was doubting, because if you do not accept the dogma, you are doubting. And it was so an experience there, being treated. And I have an anecdote, which we have time, I will tell, but that was the second phase of journey. And the third was Making Divorce Iranian Style with Kim Longenato, the brilliant documentary filmmaker. And my research until that moment was very much criticized by Iranian, especially feminists, because I showed the complexity of the situation, whereas they were expecting that, I would basically show that Islam is oppressing women. But I showed that how complex it is. There is not one Islam, and there is not one way of operating, and women have agency. And when the film came out, it was extremely successful. So I was accepted within the feminist academia. And that was a big lesson for me, that if you never can have a voice or power within a discourse or within an institution, you need to acquire it outside, then come inside. And that was, within the religious institution, I had no voice. I was seen as a feminist, which, is anathema. And within the feminist studies, I was seen as Islamist because I was talking about Islam. But with having that credibility, both in my academic life and so things changed. And then by that time, I was working on Islamic feminism because there was a new voice coming. There was a new scholarship, and it started in Iran in 1992. I could see it. Then I came to know about sisters in Islam. So I was studying them again studying them, and met Zaina Anwar, the founder of Sisters in Islam, one of the founders, in a conference in Harvard. And then in 2000, she wrote to me, and they had a meeting, a conference on family law. So she asked me for advice, who to invite to write a paper on construction of gender in Islamic law and what question to ask. So I basically gave her a set of questions and then say, why don't you write it yourself? And that was the first time that I was writing for non-academic audience. So I had to place myself. I had also to position myself and provide answers, not to ask questions, not only analysis. So that really took me to the reformist thought. And since then, this is the area of my work, contributing to the construction of an egalitarian jurisprudence from within Islamic legal tradition. So the work is continuing. And the last book is basically, I will talk about it later. And it is basically, I wanted, because there is now, when I started in 1980s, Islamic feminism the term did not exist. In 1990s, it was contradiction in terms. And in 2000, it was something which was really, really there in the public space. And when I started this book in 2009, I started idea of the book was in 2009. There were so many voices, and I wanted these voices to introduce there to the audience, to the readers, especially to the women's rights activists, because they don't have much time to read. And also academics speak in a language that sometimes is not totally easy to access. So that was the idea behind this book.
Oh, amazing. I mean, it feels like a privilege even just to hear you tell us your journey. So thank you so much for sharing that with us with such generosity. And, there's certain things that you said that really sort of jumped out to me in that. And, I invite the audience as well who are here with us to, ask questions and pop them into the chat box as they come along. But I mean, first of all, the lived experience of women, how deprived our own tradition is when, you know, multiple voices are not engaging with it, that you were able to ask questions was so important, because you asked different questions. You asked questions that the tradition hadn't been asked perhaps ever, or not for a long time, or not in a way in which others could also benefit from those questions and the answers that you developed for them, or the conversations that you generated as a result of those questions. So the importance of women's lived experience coming into the process of knowledge building. But I love also, I'm so moved by what you spoke about with regards to Iranian women being able to make their demands of the system because they spoke its language. So again, the importance of sort of religious literacy and speaking, you called it the language of the law. And I feel like your books really give that to people. They give us the language of the law. It makes it very difficult for people to argue. I mean, I know when I've taught in university spaces, and you have students of many different hues, and I've had very patriarchally minded young Muslim men and women in my classroom sometimes, and simply putting to them the question of what's the difference between Sharia and fiqh and Islamic law? I mean, I've seen people, you know, students in my class almost sort of discombobulate because it's not a question that they've ever thought of before. And yet it is one so central to being emancipated from those oppressive ways of thinking about our religion. So, you know, even the questions that you give us and the language that you give us are so important. And then, of course, women's networks and being plugged into them. And I think that we live in a time now, you know, one of the blessings and curse, I suppose, that we have in this world is that we are connected via the internet. And, you know, the internet has brought us many troubles, but it also brings us this blessing of being able to create global networks and see what's going on in different parts of the world. I mean, you know, for you to be working on Iran and Morocco in the 80s when you were, I mean, that would have been so arduous, I would imagine. That would have been really difficult. You have to be physically present in both geographical spaces. And now, you know, the world is at our fingertips in so many ways, isn't it? But you mentioned right at the end there, this sort of the genesis of the term Islamic feminism, how it didn't exist in the 80s, sort of started to emerge in the 90s, but was seen as an oxymoron. And in you know, in the 21st century, it is here. But it's still contested, isn't it? And there are still people who do think that Islam has given a particular role to men and a particular role to women, and that people just must submit to that, and that there is a wisdom to it. And, you know, there's this sort of peer pressure that is created around this. And there are people who do still think that Islam and feminism are an oxymoron to one another. So could you talk to us a little bit more about this? You know, how do you respond to that?
Yes, I think people, both the powers that are there, do not want us to ask questions. Either it is the religious power or it's a secular power, which really none of them are democratic, okay, whether to be secular or religious. And that is one thing. And then I always say that, you know, when we say Islamic feminism, it is a composite word. We need to think who's Islam and who's feminism. Because, of course, the Islam of Taliban is not compatible with feminism. You cannot have it. But you cannot reduce Islam to that. What we get from religion is always an interpretation. And religion is for people. And unfortunately, women's voices have been silenced in that. And in all religions. And now women are claiming that voice. I think, you know, the women voices were there from the very beginning, but we don't have it in our tradition. And also feminism on its own now is not above is not necessarily democratic, necessarily for women, for all women. So it depends what feminism. So that composition, and the fact is that it is a reality. And I am among the first who came up with Islamic feminism. And that was when I went back to Iran in 1992. Zanan magazine, Zanan literally means women. And it was a magazine, a journal monthly that came out. And those who were running it were those who actually were participants in the Islamic Revolution. They were, I can say, they were Islamist women. And by 10 years after the revolution, they came to realize that that interpretation of Islam is not going to be to the benefit of women. So they started to have a voice. And in a paradoxical way, the Islamic Republic gave women a political role. And because before that, women were in the public space, but only the women from certain classes and certain without much religion. So any symbol of religion in public space was not tolerated. But after the revolution, women were encouraged because of the war and because the authorities needed women there. So women were there. And, once they are in the public space, they start asking questions. So I could see that these women are feminists in the sense that they are arguing for rights. And they have this consciousness. But also, even at that time, feminism for me has been a knowledge project. It gives us tools, and they were using these tools in order to go through the text, in order to go through the tradition, in order to be critical of the public policy, which was justified in the name of Islam. So I thought, no name for them apart from Islamic feminism. Then I came to know about Sisters in Islam, and that was the first women's group that came into existence in 1988. And these were women who had no qualms to call them Islamic, call themselves Islamic or Muslim, and feminist. So it was a phenomenon. It was coming, and in different parts of the world. So I think you cannot deny it now, because it is a reality. And at that time, it was emergent. It was an emergent, but you have now as critical voices, and also in academia. Many universities that have Islamic studies teach Islamic feminism. There are posts advertised on that. And so it is getting acceptance within academia, secular academia. And religious studies, centers of religious learning, they have to come to terms with it. Because I really think that the whole idea of equality, especially gender equality, confronts the pre-modern Islamic tradition with an epistemological crisis, in the sense that, it challenges the whole basis of the knowledge, how they came to know what Quran says, because they came to know it through a patriarchal lens, through their own context, but the context is different. So they find it difficult to come to terms to it, but they have to.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting what you say, because even those who would seek to deny Islamic feminism as a force or as a possibility or as something that's actually very much present, you can see that that their own discourses are very much shaped by the questions and the possibilities that are presented by Islamic feminism. It's undeniable. But I want us to veer us back to your book, because it's so tempting to just stay on these topics with you for many hours. But you know, in your response to this question, you started by saying, well, what do we mean by Islam and what do we mean by feminism? To define these things and to recognize that actually they signify multiple definitions for various people. And so what I really appreciated about your book, Journey Towards Gender Equality in Islam, is that you are very careful not to become not to homogenize in your language throughout this book. So you give us insight into 6 scholars, 3 men and 3 women, who have quite distinct and even sometimes contradicting approaches or understandings. So I know some people might find that a little unsatisfying because we're so used to being told, black and white, here are the answers. But for me, I love this because it was fascinating to see our Islamic tradition can be so varyingly engaged with, and that it lends itself to a multiplicity of readings. So can you just tell us, just very briefly, who these six are and why you chose these public intellectuals in particular?
Our tradition in the past was extremely pluralistic and rich. And that is why we have different schools of law. But with the modern state, and especially with the political Islam, we could not have it without a modern state. So it is a product of modernity. And it became enclosed. And also Muslim became defensive. And I will talk about it, but I want to say that having a community is important. Because before meeting with Zaina Anwar and Sisters in Islam, I was an outsider, both within the feminist academia and also Islamic studies, because no longer I was interested in that classical anthropology that I learned. And finding Sisters in Islam, I could have a voice, because this voice needs to be resonated. And these six scholars, I started the book in 2009, and I have interviews with more than 12 people. But at the end, I decided to choose only six. And two of them are from my own context, Iran. And one is Asma Lambrabet from Morocco. That is a context that I feel that I know very well because I did research and I continue that. And there are three others are based in the West. And which is, in fact, my context at the same time. And these are those scholars that were groundbreaker and trailblazers in their own field. For instance, Abdullahi al-Naim is the first scholar who really had something meaningful to say about human rights and Islam. And Amina Wadud, which is a woman and Quran, and she was really a pioneer in so many ways. And at the same time, she was also occupying and claiming the ritual space by being the first woman who did this public prayer, to be the imam of the public prayer leader. And Asma Lambrabet in Morocco, and I see her as the heir of Fatima Mernissi. And she writes in French in a popular way, and which is very acceptable, and also in Arabic. And Khaled Abul Fazal, he is actually the one who brought the idea that if you read a hadith or even a verse of the Quran, and it just goes against your moral compass, and you feel that you cannot accept it, then you have the right and duty to take a conscientious pause and do the research and see whether this interpretation that is in the tradition is the interpretation that is according to the justice of Islam, to the principles and values. So all of them, in a way, gives us a methodology, a way of thinking. Amina Wadud, Asma Lambrabet. So I'm interested in methodology. I'm not interested in only interpretation. How do you come to know what you know? Through what ways and what ways of thinking? And the two other are from Iran. And I share my journey with them because I am older than them, but we experienced the same thing. And the last one, Mohsen Kadivar, he has this method of saying that classical ijtihad is no longer serving our needs as Muslim. What we need is structural ijtihad, which is questioning the foundations of thinking, the assumptions that the jurists have, and the knowledge sources that they rely on, and also the importance of ethics. And the last one, Sadiqa Basmari, she is a woman who is who did classical fiqh, taught at the university, one of the few women who studied there. And she is actually engaging with the tradition from within to show that what the Fuqaha says actually are not what the Quran says, which is so important, using their own methodology to show that. I was just reading before coming here on BBC that she has written an open letter. She is so courageous, to Khamenei, that is the supreme leader of Iran, and telling him that he has responsibility for the consequences of the policy of imposing hijab, because the Quran does not impose hijab, and goes through all the lists and ask him that, give us the sources. Where do you get this? Wow. And one of Faqih's opinion. So this is amazing, you know. I chose them because, you know, they influenced me. And I thought they were for me, it's not enough to be a scholar, a public intellectual, an activist. And all of them were also activists on that level.
Incredible. I mean, I really hope that, because I recognize that we're covering so much breadth in such a short amount of time. So I just want to say to the listeners, those who are joining us now, those who are listening to the recording afterwards, you know, I really hope that this conversation, you know, encourages you to pick up the book, because it's so inspiring just to hear this. It's so inspiring to hear you speak about them and your own work. And really, I do hope that people will go away and read this book and all of the other books that you have penned for us, because they are so important. You know, I think you talked about, we've already mentioned, you know, religious literacy, but you're absolutely right. Until scholarship informs our praxis, you know, actually shapes the way that we are present every day in the world as Muslims, that scholarship really it just gathers dust. I mean, I know from my own experience, similarly, it was once I got married that I suddenly had all these questions pop up into my mind about Islam and my place as a woman, and as a woman of faith. What does that mean? And, you know, if I hadn't had access to this scholarship, it would have been devastating for me. But at the same time, I do recall reading work. I remember reading Amina Wadud's work and thinking, I was a child when she wrote this. Why wasn't I raised with some of these ideas? And there were other works that I read that were written before I was born. And I just thought, how is it that there is this scholarship, there is this knowledge out there, but those who have the most to gain from accessing that work are not accessing it. We don't even know it exists. So I fully agree with you that, you know, scholarship is vital, it's invaluable, we need it, but at the same time we need the activism. Otherwise the scholarship ends up in the ivory tower of academia. And so, you know, this brings us to my final question, and then I will open up to the questions from the audience. At the end of the book, you bring us to this wonderful work of Musawa, this global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. And you are, of course, one of the founding members of that. So please tell us a little bit more about Musawa and your work with Musawa, and what you do, and how viewers can learn more.
Yes, Musawa came into existence in 2009. And in fact, in so many ways, Musawa is a child of Sisters in Islam as the first group in Malaysia. And I was involved with Sisters in Islam. And by that time, we came to the conclusion that there is a need for the global voice to speak in the name of Islam. Not every, women are not there as a group. And one of our main challenges in bringing that organization, Musawa, first we thought that we will have we do scholarship and we have a big meeting and then everything is done. But we realized that soon, while we were doing the planning committee, that we need a movement. What we are talking is a movement. And it was a challenge to really bring women's rights activists, women's NGOs to talk in Muslim context, to talk about Islam, because they saw Islam as patriarchal. And also they didn't want to be identified with Islam, because Islam for many is political Islam. And that is really so sad. But finally, because of credibility, especially that Zaina Anwar has, we had a planning committee that represented different Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries. And we came up with a framework for action, which was based on the scholarship we'd done. And one of them was the difference between Sharia and fiqh and the state law. So we used that language. And in Framework for Action, we build on the work of Moroccan women, because Moroccan women succeeded to change the family law and make it egalitarian in 2004. And we build on their work, and we work on 4 levels: Islamic teaching, human rights, standards as well, and national constitutions, because in all constitutions in Muslim countries, the principle of equality is accepted. And then lived reality. So we produce knowledge at 4 levels, because they speak to each other and the change is happening at each level. And our first book was Wanted, Equality and Justice in Muslim Family. And after that, we came into existence. We started our work, and we bring scholarship and activism together to argue for equality and justice from within Islamic framework. So one of areas of our work that I am also a part of it and leading is knowledge building. And that is really producing new knowledge from within. That is new egalitarian knowledge. And another one is capacity building. We have courses on Islam, justice, equality, because it is important for women to have the knowledge of the religion, to be able to be literate in religion's knowledge, to speak that language. And also religion is so important. You know, some of us, women like us who are here, we are privileged. We have a choice. But a large majority of women do not have a choice. And I think for them, we need to have not to be their voice, but to reflect their voice and also to enable their voices to be heard. And another area of our work is international advocacy, that is engagement with the international human rights, especially with CEDAW, the Convention for Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And these are the people, you know, these committees are, CEDAW committee, are appointed or selected from different different countries. And among them are Muslim countries. And their role is to have a negotiation with all countries to implement the CEDAW framework, which wants to get rid of discrimination. And it is so important that they don't define equality. They want to identify what is discrimination. And for them, they didn't know, they didn't have any legitimacy to talk about Islam. So we went there and we did seminar for them, and we write statements for others, and just introducing this difference between Sharia, fiqh, and state law gave them the new language. When the country representative comes and says, oh, we cannot change the law because it is against our religion, against our tradition, against our culture. So they remind them of the history and show of other countries. And that engagement has been very important. And then we have communication. And now we are on Facebook, and there is a young generation in Musawa. And I think, you know, it is hope. And we are in the beginning. We are now 13 years old. So we came into existence in 2009. No, 14 years old now. Yes, we came into existence in February 2009. And we continue. And Sofia, you are a great part of Musawa. And the work that you do is so important, because apart from knowledge and activism, we need intermediaries. Intermediaries who make this knowledge known. And unfortunately, not many scholars have that language and that ability. And activists do not have that knowledge. But your role is so important. And festivals like this is so important, because we need a community. We need to hear each other. And I would suggest that, please check Musawa and check its resources. We have 4 knowledge briefs that talks about the difference between Sharia and fiqh, how change can come from within Islamic Republic, Islamic framework, and also how the question of gender equality in Islam. Because the moment that we talk about equality, the idea is equality means identicality. And the argument is we are different. Of course we are different. Men and women are different, but that doesn't mean that they can't be equal. And CEDAW as well. And then a number of policy briefs which touches on all issues, rights to divorce, financial rights after the divorce, polygamy, child marriage, all this. So these are accessible knowledge. And 2 books, Men in Charge, with a question mark, which we deal with the 2 main concepts that in illegal, in fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence, that place women under male guardianship. And we question that. And we actually show these are not Quranic concepts, these are juristic concepts. And then our latest book, what is it called, Sofia?
Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage.
Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage. And that one is, we enter into reconstruction. We actually provide, because the project name was Adl and Ihsan. So when we take out these 2 concepts that give male authority, which is the basis of jurisprudence, we need to replace it with another concept. One is Adl, which is justice, and Ihsan, goodness, beauty, compassion, and love.
And I feel like we've come full circle beautifully, because we began this session lamenting the loss of beauty and joy and love in the public sphere at the hands of Islamic clerics, sadly in Iran and beyond, really. And now we've come to a space where we are talking about reasserting that love and joy and beauty and justice from within Islam back into the lives of Muslims. We do have a few questions. What I'm going to do is there's 3 questions that are all sort of similar to one another. So I'll put those to, I'll just give one of them. And hopefully everybody's happy with that. That covers all grounds. So Zara has a question for you, Professor Ziba. She says, of course, she says, thank you. This is a privilege to be able to listen to you. She says, do you think that the reluctance of some women's rights activists to engage in discussions about Islam and feminism, as well as the opposition of others to an inclusive approach, indicates a knowledge gap about Islam that makes people, other than traditional clerics, hesitant to discuss religion alongside feminism? And so there's a theme coming up in a lot of the questions about what do we do about women who themselves are resistant, who've sort of internalized patriarchal interpretations of Islam as well, who are not necessarily open to hearing these things. How do we, what are your thoughts on that?
I think, that is the main problem that we are facing. Please don't forget that women always made a good bargain with patriarchy, because they always gained something from patriarchy. And women are not a unified group, and to be a woman in a different class and different with education, and everything is different. I think it is resistance is more than anything is ideological, and thinking in binary terms, that it is either Islam or feminism. And most women do choose feminism, but also I think it is the lack of the absence of voices, because you know what women hear is the voices of the tradition, which is a patriarchal voice and does not allow you any question. But when they start the questions, when they experience injustice, and they experience injustice which is justified in the name of Islam, it is then that they start asking questions. And I really believe that experience is the source of knowledge. And one thing that I show in my last book is that experience is the source of both theological knowledge and jurisprudential knowledge. So it's a difficult task how to convince them, because you know some people do not want to give up their privilege, but at the same time I think the knowledge is not accessible. Having conversations is important, and also taking this ideological lens. Not everything about religion is negative, and not everything about secularism and feminism is absolutely in the benefit of others. So it is a different way of thinking, and more than anything, have a community. I would suggest reading groups is the best thing, because it is through this reading with group, with a community, that you actually come to experience something. And because I love novels, you know, the feminist literature is such a gift that we have. And this feminist literature can give us much more than any academic work.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Ziba Mir-Hosseini. I think I could, again, just ask you a million more questions. And I know that there are so many more questions in the meeting, in the chats. And I'm really sorry to everybody who had a question but didn't get to ask. Please do, re-listen to this talk. I feel like there's going to be so much more that you get the second time round listening to this. Just 3 books to put on everybody's radar. You know, go off to Amazon now, wherever you want to buy your books from. So Journeys Towards Gender Equality in Islam. This is the book that we were discussing today. And then Men in Charge with a question mark. And then also Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage. I think that these are a great starting point for a lot of the questions that have remained unanswered in the chat box. But I hope that you've all found so much food for thought and lots of enrichment and lots of encouragement and courage through today's discussion as well. And do follow Professor Ziba Mir-Hosseini's work, especially through Musawa and what they do. Thank you so much for being here and answering our questions and giving so much of your time, Professor. And thank you, Sabine, for hosting today and giving us this platform. And thank you to everybody who has joined us today. I'll pass it back to you, Sabine.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And being in conversation with you, Sofia, is always so enlightening for me as well, because you ask the kind of questions that brings the best in people they can explain. And that is a talent.
Thank you so much.
That you have.
Thank you so much, Professor Ziba and Sofia, for this enlightening discussion. And I hope, we have more of such conversations in the future as well. So thank you.